Kia ora everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name's Renee. I like to read books and then talk about them on the internet. Okay, I'm just gonna be straight up and say that I'm recording this for the second time because I recorded it the first time without sound. Annoying. But we're gonna pretend like this is the first time and we're gonna nail it. It's gonna be good, it's gonna be quick, it's going to be precise. You're all going to come away from this being like, wow, I want to read those books. Okay? Today I'm going to be chatting to you about everything I read in March. March was a busy month outside of reading. Yeah, lots of work stuff going on. It was my birthday. Had some nice time off, which was great. Yeah, just like a good balance of seeing friends, doing things, but I felt busy but in a nice way. Let's get into the books. Speed round. First up, I read The Temporary by Rachel Cusk. If you didn't know, I am doing a Rachel Cusk reading challenge this year. I am attempting to read all of Rachel Cusk's published work that I haven't already read. So I have one book a month basically. There are 12 books that I haven't read of hers and this was my March book. Just decided to go from her oldest to present day because that seems like a good order to go in. This book focuses on two narrators. Francine, who is a temp worker. She works in a lot of office type situations, very kind of sexist environments. This book was written in 1995, so you know what it would have been like. And then this male character, Ralph, who is very unhappy in his work and is working in some kind of free newspaper in London. The book is set in London, kind of this corporate world. These two meet at a party. Ralph is attracted to Francine. She's supposed to be this very beautiful, charismatic person with these great looks, which he's enamored by. They go on a date, but they both quickly learn that they're not really interested in each other or the other person. But there is this self-inflated ego that is stopping them from accepting that the other person might want to reject them. So you have this very interesting kind of dynamic going on between them where neither of them really wants to be dating the other, but neither wants to admit or accept that that person couldn't possibly not want to date them. And that's what much of the novel is about. It's about their different interactions. The chapters go chapter on, chapter off for each character, so a lot of the times you're experiencing both of their perspectives on the same event or directly after. So where one character kind of ends, the other one picks up, and you're definitely getting like a side of both stories type situation, man versus woman. This is how they're very different type of thing. I will say that I feel like the book has dated quite a bit, even though 1995, that's not that long ago. I mean, 25 years. I guess it's quite a long time, but it's 28 years, sorry. It does feel as though, you know, this type of situation just simply wouldn't happen. Someone would have ghosted the other person nowadays and you'd just be like, you'd get on with your lives. You wouldn't be this concerned with this person that you weren't really interested in. So that's kind of like an interesting question that is posed, like, want this person to think a certain way of you, so therefore they're spending a lot of time with each other in order to try to make sure that that is like put across in a certain way. But other than that, I wouldn't say like the context or the content of this book is like all that interesting to me. I appreciate and love Cusk's witty writing. I think she wrote the dialogue in this book really well, and those were some of my favourite parts. But other than that, I didn't really get anything else from this book that was all that kind of interesting or new. I imagine that it would have been like interesting to read this book back when it first was published, but maybe not so much now. Okay, next up I read Women Talking by Miriam Toews. Miriam Toews. I always get confused about her last name. I absolutely loved this book. It is tie with another on my top books for the month. It's definitely like way up there of top books of the year. Loved it. It is a fictionalized story of a true event. These women in this closed Mennonite community having these quite violent, horrific dreams, nightmares, waking up with bruises and beaten bodies and blood everywhere. They're initially being told that this is their female imagination, that these things aren't really happening to them, or even that this is God's punishment for their sins. It is eventually found out that these women are actually being drugged by other men in their community and abused. Women and young children, I should say. The community has decided to get the police involved, and while the judicial system is kind of deciding what they want to do, the women are back in the community and deciding what they want to do. So they have three options. One option to do nothing, one option to stay and fight, or the other option to leave. And many of the women in the community who have experienced this abuse, these attacks, have decided to do nothing. And this book is really about the discussions that the women who are deciding between staying and fighting or going or leaving. And the book is set out as these notes, these minutes from these meetings, which are being written from one of the only male characters featured in the book, August Epp, who is an excommunicated member of the community who was once sent away, but then his family was sent away and then he came back. And he has the ability to read and write. These women don't, so he has been asked to do this for them. That's the simple kind of premise. These women are gathering together to do something that they have never done before, which is discuss and decide their own futures, what they think is best, in a very diplomatic, pragmatic, logical way. They are looking at every possible option and outcome, the ways that those decisions will affect everyone, not just their own individual selves and their own individual feelings about this. They are thinking about the ways in which their decisions will uphold their faith and their beliefs, whether or not those decisions will truly reflect what they believe. It is just the most beautiful exploration of decision making amongst a group of caring, emotional, hurt, rageful women in the most obviously right way. The way that they are going about this seems like the way that all these kinds of decisions should be made in these kinds of settings, and politically and domestically, and it's just the most beautiful example of women-led spaces, places, communities can look like. It obviously speaks to different types of patriarchal oppression in communities that women face. I don't think that it speaks specifically to just this very specific type of community where this one bad thing has happened. It obviously highlights all patriarchal, oppressive environments where women will have experienced silencing or not had space to be able to sit around and discuss or be given a voice. And so, yeah, it just spoke to so many different levels of the way that women can be empowered and feel powerful and have agency over themselves, their lives, their children, and do it in such a graceful, gentle, kind way. They each allow space for these characters to feel all the feelings, to be angry, to yell, to feel like the whole thing is unfair, to question whether or not they have these beliefs still. It's just so beautiful to read and witness, and I just had the best experience reading this book, and can't wait to reread it and to get more out of it and to spend more time with these characters, because they were some of my favorite that I've read this year, and they just felt fully realized. And yeah, I loved it so much. So highly recommend that one. Next I read Pure Colour by Sheila Heti. I was thinking about this one, and I actually am having a hard time thinking about how to describe this. It's a very surrealist, dream-like, abstract novel to me. It doesn't have a lot of points for me to refer back to that kind of feel anchored in anything real. When I think about this book, I think more about emotions, feelings, processes of dealing with emotions, and that's really hard to talk about. It's a book that tries to use categorization as, I think, a framework for this novel, but I don't know whether that was the right way for Heti to go about it. She likes using almost like gimmicky or anchor points for people to exist in her novels. In Motherhood, she used the flipping of the coin, which felt quite gimmicky, and in this she uses this categorization of different peoples in this first draft that God has created of the world, where people are split into three groups of bird people, fish people, and bear people, and they each represent different aspects of a person's personality, I guess. To me, that felt a bit unnecessary. Like it got brought up initially, and then it kind of didn't feel all that relevant throughout the book. So I question why she kind of chose to do that. The best part for me were the parts where the character of Miriam was in the leaves. Those parts felt the strongest to me, as weird as it sounds, but her talking about grief and working through that and being with her father, and the idea of not wanting to go on without him was just the most realised and the most clear ideas that she had in the book for me. And then upon reading this, I found out that Sheila Heti actually lost her father while she was writing this book. So that makes perfect sense as to why that specific part of the novel was the most memorable and the strongest for me. Other than that, I can't really say what this is about, other than a woman named Miriam who has lost her father and is kind of dealing with this intense love with this other character named Annie. But there's things that don't really happen in the story that feel all that significant to me. So yeah, I struggled with this one quite a bit. Okay, next I read Lapvona by Ottessa Moshfegh. This one I don't think I enjoyed it, but I think I enjoyed the discussion after it and thinking about it. This was a highly popular novel that was very anticipated, and I was trying to avoid a lot of the reviews and critiques around it because I knew I wanted to read it, and I don't like to know too much going into a book, but I ended up probably learning a bit more than I wanted to. The one thing I was really surprised from reading this was how little I heard people talk about the gory, gross, disgusting elements of the book. They felt gratuitous and heavy-handed in this book that I'm just off the bat like really shocked that that's not something that I knew about sooner. This novel is Ottessa Moshfegh's first attempt at a multi-narrative novel told through these different characters in this fictional place set in a medieval time called Lapvona. It's this village with these people who are all ruled over by Lord William, who lives at the top of a mountain, top of a hill, overlooking Lapvona and a castle. He is your typical evil lord. He holds all the power, he holds all the resources, he has access to different armies and different groups to basically terrorize and torture the people of Lapvona. Every raid, every drought, every bad thing that happens to the people of Lapvona is dictated and controlled by William. And much of the story is about the way that people in the village infiltrate or begin to climb ladders to get to Lord William. The story itself and the plot is like kind of interesting. I don't really want to like talk about that too much or like give anything away. I think it's better to go into it and read a book for a plot sometimes and not know. I think the things that this book is talking about mostly is character and the lengths that people will go to in order to hold power over someone, to be entertained, to push someone outside their comfort zone, to survive. There are all these human behavioural elements about this book that I find super interesting, but I just felt weren't looked at or developed enough because Ottessa Moshfegh has not, this is her first time writing a multiple narrative perspective. We all know that she can do a single narrative perspective, the very internal thoughts of someone. We know she can do that well. Eileen is one of my favourite books of hers, and I think that character study of that person, you are able to understand, empathise, perhaps not agree with, but understand and empathise where that person's coming from because of Moshfegh's ability to get inside their head, show all aspects, including the ugly characteristics of those people. But yeah, I just felt like that digging deeper, that going that little bit deeper was missing because we had so many characters like Marek, like Jude, like Ina, and I can't really speak to what those characters, what was motivating those characters, what was driving them, what they were thinking all that much beyond surface things. And then I think back to the disgust, like I really enjoyed Jalen's interview with Ottessa Moshfegh that he did on his podcast, Reading the Room. I thought it was a great insight into her and her writing, and she spoke on disgust in that episode, and it was really helpful to understand, I guess, why she uses it as a device in her writing. And she kind of spoke to it being a point of difference, at offering the reader or the person experiencing it a new way of looking at something that you're perhaps being exposed to over and over again. Well, I agree with that, and I think that that is really clever and really smart, and I can see how she's using it. I just felt like there was so much of it in this book that it clouded everything else. Like, I don't know what else I was supposed to see through all the cannibalism and the gross behaviour. It's definitely made me think though, which I really enjoy. Even if I don't enjoy the book specifically, I love a book that will make me continue to think about why I felt that way. Why did I not like it? Why did I react to feeling uncomfortable in that way so much? It's always interesting. and I always appreciate it. Okay, next I've read Red Parts by Maggie Nelson. This is a memoir / true crime non-fiction book. Maggie Nelson had an aunt who was murdered in 1969. She was thought to have been murdered by a serial killer who was responsible for the murders of other women in the area around that time. And for years that was kind of the verdict, or what her family all thought. But in 2004, new evidence was discovered and the case was reopened, and they were putting this new person on trial. And the book is that experience. It's Maggie Nelson's experience with the trial, her family, kind of their thought process, a lot of her own personal life happenings at the time. She kind of addresses other personal things like the death of her father, and she's really kind of looking at death and these horrific acts and the stuff that kind of gets churned up when you're in this very hyper-specific situation that she's in, when you're experiencing the kind of unearthing and re-looking at the death of a family member, one that she never knew, but one that other members of her family knew really well. And it's an interesting kind of perspective to approach this with. She has some kind of distance to it because she didn't know Jane personally, but she still feels this connection to her in some ways. This is a great companion piece to Jane, Maggie Nelson's poetry collection about her Aunt Jane. Those two books are quite interesting to read and look at side by side. It's a very heavy kind of book. This describes some pretty graphic stuff. I would just be wary of that. It also looks at and it talks a little bit about culture's obsession with true crime and the idea of the murdered white woman, why people become so obsessed with that type of dead woman, why there's never a woman of colour at the centre of those obsessions and those horrible stories. It was a really good book to read, and I read it as a buddy read with Clara from Chapters of Clara on Instagram. That was really, really good. Highly recommend. I also read this book, Women Talking, as a buddy read with Natalia from Instagram as well. Book Epiphanies is her handle. I'll leave those below. Okay, next I read Beloved by Toni Morrison. I'll just say off the bat, I read this as a buddy read with my friend Melanie on Instagram. She's great. We both absolutely loved this book so much. I think she is now officially on some Toni Morrison kick and is going through all of her stuff, which I definitely want to do. But I'm just trying to sit and savor this still because I loved it. This is a ghost story in all aspects, I guess. We have this character Setha at the centre, who is an escaped slave from Ohio. She's escaped to Cincinnati, and there she lives with, in current times, or at the time the novel is starting, with her daughter Denver and the ghost of one of her other babies who died. We learned that at one point she had her 2 sons as well living with her, and also her mother-in-law who's passed away. Her 2 sons have left, presumably because of the ghost in the house. One day a man named Paul D turns up on her doorstep, and we learn that he is also someone from the homestead, I guess that's what you call them, Sweet Home, where they both were slaves. He is from there as well, and so they have this shared experience, and he shacks up with Setha, and he manages to run the ghost out of the house, and they all seem to be living quite happily together, Setha's daughter Denver and Paul D, until one day they come home and they find this mysterious young girl sitting on a tree stump. She doesn't know anything about where she's come from. The only thing she knows is that she's called Beloved. This book, I think, is a really good book to read for plot. It's a really good book to read for the different themes that it has. This would be an excellent book club book. And but I don't want to speak too much to the plot, because I think part of the best thing about reading this is not knowing what happens or the mysteriousness around it. I think the things that I found the most interesting, or that have stuck out to me, were the ways that Morrison chose to write about slavery. When we first are introduced to these characters, Setha and Paul D, and them kind of remembering and reminiscing on times at Sweet Home, there is this kind of lightness to it. There is fond memories, well, and it's not until the novel starts to kind of propel forward that what they're actually remembering underneath is tragedy and torture, and they carry these physical scars of what they had to endure and go through, and what the true reality of slavery was actually like for them. So it's really playing with these ideas of being free, maybe physically of the shackles, but having those memories, those traumatic, and dealing with those and trying to continue living on, but still in that hopeful way. I feel like this type of story, it is heavy. There was a real playful element that Morrison infused into these characters that didn't make them sad about their lot or dwell on that so much. Towards the end, and by the end, I was interested in the ideas around motherhood and the different types of mothering that we got in the book. You got aspects of mothering from baby Suggs towards all the kids in the community where they were free. You got the ways that Setha obviously was a mother to her children, and the really hard decisions she had to make, ones that she doesn't expect anyone to understand but isn't going to try to hide from. You had aspects of mothering from the woman who was the slave master's wife. What was her name? Mrs. Garner. The ways that they were kind of lulled into this false sense of protection because they, had these people who weren't so bad. They weren't horrible to them. Yeah, there's just so much to unpack in this book, and I really, really, really loved it. Highly, highly, highly recommend. This one technically I finished in April, but I read it in most of March, so we're counting it. That is A History of My Brief Body by Billy Ray Belcourt. This is a collection of essays told in memoir type narrative. Billy Ray Belcourt is a poet, an academic. He's a queer, native to Canada man, and this collection explores, outlines his experience at all those kind of intersections of life, of his life, how he has navigated those, how he has struggled through that, and how he has, in some parts of it, found real pockets of joy, of hope, of love. I kind of spoke about this in my last video, how I struggle with this one. I don't think my feelings have changed that much about it. I don't think that this was an easy one for me to access purely because of language and perhaps experience. His experience being different to mine. That's not to say that I don't think that I can't access experiences different to mine. That's not what I'm saying at all. I just think the combination of that and his choice of language and it being as poetic and academic at the same time was really hard for me to tap into. Yeah, like I definitely read some passages or some words in parts and felt like a big dum-dum. But I am looking forward to reading his fiction. I think his style of writing coupled with fiction, even though it's auto-fiction, will be quite interesting. Okay, last book that I read in March was Among Flowers by Jamaica Kincaid. Again, I didn't actually read this book in March. I read it in April. But this was my book club pick for March, so that's why I'm putting it in this video. This is a travelogue memoir about the time that Jamaica Kincaid travelled with a group of friends to Nepal, hiked along the Himalayan landscape and collected seeds to take back to her New England garden. This book was very disappointing. I had really high hopes for this. If you've watched my channel, you know how much I love Jamaica Kincaid. I love her writing, I love her voice. Her writing feels charged, and it was just missing in this book. This whole book was exactly that. It was just a travel log, day to day. This is what we did. There were not many moments that felt like, oh, I'm reading a Jamaica Kincaid book. I got really excited about a couple of moments where I felt like she was going to tap into that interesting thought or infuse it with some of her kind of sass or emotion, and then she kind of just like did it in a really small way, and then that was it. And yeah, I was left rather unenthused about this, to be honest. The introduction set this book up to be really amazing. The introduction, yeah, has been added on afterwards, so I wonder if she's had criticism about the book not being that grounded in anything. They felt like there was no purpose to it, like why was she doing this? It seemed like a lot of work to do this one trip with just collecting seeds, you know. But yeah, I really wanted her to kind of tap into some different ideas. She mentioned in the introduction her love for gardening and how it came from her mother. I would love to hear her relationship with her mother and how that love for gardening was kind of passed down to her. She also mentioned an interesting piece of factual history about where the idea of gardens traditionally came from, which was colonization. I find that highly interesting, and I was waiting for her to tap into that. I think the fact that she's written about where she's from and it being a colonized island, and that whole act of what she's doing coming from colonial practices, so interesting. Even if she were to point out the hypocrisy of it and be self-aware as to what she's doing, or talk about the way that she's been colonized to think. I was so ready for some really interesting thought to come into play in this book, and it just never eventuated. So highly disappointed with this one. One thing I did get out of this book, I will say, is that I did learn a lot, and I got to look at some pretty flowers. I got to look up some pretty flowers online. That is the March wrap up. That's everything we read this month. We did well. We got through it a second time. If you have any thoughts, feelings, opinions, questions, notes about any of the books that I've mentioned, I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment. I'll get back to you soon. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you read in March and loved. I'll see you very soon. Bye.